Hi, this is Paul. Haven't put out a lot of monologues this week. I had classes yesterday in Ripon, California, same place where Fancy Nancy's uncle almost built a bomb shelter until the minister told him that he wasn't trusting Jesus enough, and so the bomb shelter ended and the hole in the ground was used for farm duties. Anyway, if you watch the Freddie and Paul show, you'll get the reference. If you don't watch the Freddie and Paul show, you're missing out on the most fun part of this channel. It's just a little show that we post every now and then on Sundays, and it is actually the beginning of this channel. And Freddie is always asking me, when are you going to mention the Freddie and Paul show on your show that gets all the big clicks? Well, there you go, Freddie. Mentioned. After the video I made last week about Putin, power, Ukraine, truth, and the true believers, Strawn, who some of you know has written me often throughout the history of this channel, he was the one that first pointed me to John Vervaeke. Strawn basically sent me an email suggesting that I have a bit of mission creep, that the algorithm or chasing clicks or I'm just slipping in terms of my idea that religion is always and politics is now. Last week I thought up a new way to talk about that religion is dollars and politics is cents. Religion and politics are deeply connected, but how to actually live in the midst of that relationship is by no means easy. Now, I have had the benefit and privilege of living on this world for 58 years, and what that means is that I remember the Cold War quite well. Those of you who follow Jordan Peterson know that in some ways the Cold War is the beginning of his story. When he begins Maps of Meaning in his college lectures, he begins with an imaginary tour through a Cold War missile silo. In some ways, the Cold War traumatized generations of people all over the world, probably including myself, probably at levels that I don't know about. Which makes this current moment all the more strange, because during the Cold War, the Republicans were the people who were terrified of the Great Red Scare, and the Democrats were people that thought that the Russians could be reasoned with. Round and round we went. Now, of course, I'm speaking from more the 80s, late 70s, 80s, until the fall of the Berlin Wall, which sort of marks the end of the Cold War. And, of course, when you go back to who won the Cold War, the Dems really hated Ronald Reagan, but did he sort of win the war by basically demonstrating that the Russian economy and the Soviet economy and their planned political system could not finally compete with the economic power of the West? And one of the stories that we're not paying near enough attention to is, in fact, the tremendous power of soft power and how much the West has and how little a state like Russia has. I hear some people breathlessly worried about Russian propaganda and its power in America. I don't think it has anything to compare with what's been done to Russia since the invasion of Ukraine. I'm not lamenting it. I mean, nobody here is defending the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Let me say that right off the bat. But to say Putin is crazy? No. I can understand why he did it. He's been talking about this for a very long time. He, of course, took Crimea in 2014. Putin's not crazy. He might think differently than we do. And again, for the supposed left that is all about diversity and alternative points of reference, to simply dismiss Putin as crazy just looks far, far too convenient for, well, if you actually want to pursue the truth. Anyway, back to my story. Back during the bad old days of the Cold War, when people went to church and all sorts of social oppression was the common part of the story, people wanted to imagine that there's right and left. And I think all of the talk about the right and the left is usually all about the fact that because consciousness is monofocal, Binaries are the easiest ways we can manage reality. This and not this, yes and no, up and down. All this binary thinking is partly due to the fact that consciousness is monofocal. And so as I listen to all of the bantering about the current crisis in Ukraine, I hear a lot of people trying to map the world onto this American polarization and duality of the right and the left. It's Fox News versus MSNBC, as if it's sort of always been this way. Well, let me tell you, just go ahead and look up at Wikipedia how young cable television is and how young Fox is and how young MSNBC is. And these things in some ways go back a little ways in time, but not near as much as you would imagine. History, especially if you know any of it, is far more complex. And Americans are far more united about whole ranges of things that they care not to pay attention to because they're not the difference between the salient divide that they are looking at right now. They're far more united about whole ranges of things than they are divided. I had to confess to someone recently that I voted for Ralph Nader. If you ever wonder just how progressive I sort of used to be, I never discarded the virgin birth or the resurrection of Jesus Christ, but I voted for Ralph Nader because the difference between George W. Bush and Al Gore seemed pretty minimal, which was Ralph Nader's charge. So go ahead and excoriate me in the comment section. That's fine. Where was I going with this? Oh, yeah. All of this is just way too low resolution to deal with the complexity of the real world out there and the number of layers that are going on. In the meantime, there's an evangelical Cold War underway, which is, of course, for me, in some ways closer to home. I remember when the Phil Visser podcast first came to YouTube. I listened to it quite regularly. Of course, I knew who Phil Visser was, and I really enjoyed his book about Larry and Bob. There's a lot of wisdom in it. One of the videos I want to make one of these days is the whole relationship about persons and moral valence, because isn't it amazing how people just become bad and good? In fact, Sky Jatani, well, maybe I'll play his little speech in here.
Yeah, it's an interesting question whether Vlad the Impaler, whether Putin overextended himself and made some assumptions that didn't turn out to be true. What are your thoughts since you recorded with Mr. French?
Well, so Sky Jatani and David French had done a podcast where they talked both about the dangers of Ukraine and, once again, which has been a staple in many places, dread Christian nationalism. Now, I intend to do a podcast or two directly to that because I am finding so many of these conversations so completely amnesiac with respect to the relationships of... I do not understand how you can make these statements if you know anything about the history of the Christian church in North America before the 1980s. I'm just baffled by the historical ignorance of, well, why should Americans don't pay attention to history? Why should Christian Americans pay attention to history? Anyway, on to what is the soundbite that I want to highlight.
I can't claim to have any expertise whatsoever about geopolitical realities in Ukraine and Russia. All I know is what other people are also seeing on television and in the media. But other than the humanitarian horrors and crisis that are unfolding and the refugees and the people caught in the middle of this completely unnecessary war, which is tragic, I do...
Completely unnecessary war. It depends on whose necessity. And, there have been many people that have not been slow to mention the fact that, well, the video I'm about to play mentions that the United States has been in 7 wars since the end of the Cold War. And, I, again, given my history as Tripp calls me, a communist, given my history of leftist politics, let's say, most of the lefties were horrified at the Second Iraq War. And George W. Bush and the neocons were, horrible imperialists and unnecessary war and WMDs, on and on and on and on. So, my history has very much been anti-war. And then suddenly, as in the video that I made before, that's why I read Eric Hoffer's True Believers. We get swept up and we rally and we want to fight, and we see these images and the same screens that show us the superhero movies that we watch are the same screens that we're watching these other characters on. And how is Zelensky not sort of a hero in the sense of all the other heroes? Like Stories of Old just had a really good video out on heroes, and that's another thing I've wanted to treat it again. I haven't had any time this week to make videos, and so the question was, which video do I make first? And this one is the one.
Do find myself inspired by the response of the Ukrainians.
And it is inspirational. Why is it inspirational? Because it's inspirational for all the reason things are inspirational to us. It's the self-sacrifice, but it's, of course, deep at the heart of nationalism. At the end of the Second World War, the West had a long, probably not too long, because of the Cold War, had a bit of a soul-searching moment with respect to nationalism. Okay, nationalism bad. Well, then what replaces nationalism? And what, in fact, are the religious underpinnings beneath this? All of these four individuals, and again, I hold no ill will towards any of these individuals. I don't call them evil. I might disagree with them on politics, and I think they're not paying near enough attention to history. And perhaps it's not their fault. None of them are historians, and neither am I. But we're just all watching this on TV, and we just tend to be caught up with whatever our current little political / religious tribe is and follow along with the talking points.
I mean, the resistance from the president on down to, old women in the streets, like they are just an inspiring example of resistance. And I also wonder if this is actually the beginning of the end for Vladimir Putin.
Yeah.
Not just because the Ukrainian resistance will cause him to pay a great cost with the military, but the way the world is uniting now against him.
Right.
And isolating.
And now this is also interesting because now Sky is a convert, if you've known his story, and I've heard him talk about his story before. He became, if I recall correctly, it's been a number of years since I listened to this regular, he became a Christian in college. All of these four are children of American revivalism and evangelicalism. And in many ways, these individuals, Sky Jitani, former editor at Christianity Today, and Phil Visser, in many ways, sort of almost a papal figure with respect to VeggieTales, formed a young generation, Kinnaman, who has sort of taken on the Barna mantle. And, again, I follow these people on Twitter. I hold no ill will towards them. If they'd like to have come on my channel, or maybe I'll just invite them on Twitter. I doubt any of them will take up the invitation, because in terms of status, you usually, just like you're not supposed to punch down, you seldom speak down either. It's usually speak up to, if CNN or MSNBC or Fox News calls, you answer the call and you get on a bigger platform. But how the world is uniting is inspirational. All of this evangelicalism that always feared one world government. Now, none of these individuals, to my knowledge, are terribly tied in with dispensationalism. But that undercurrent of, the world is uniting, therefore it must be right. It's never that simple.
isolating Russia, it's a little too late, but it's not too late, but it would have been better had they done this sooner. But he may actually have just killed his own future.
And I agree with that. I think Putin, he had a bad hand in a lot of ways that we're going to talk about. He probably overplayed it. He probably underestimated the world's reaction to it. I think in many ways, this whole war has been a demonstration of the power of soft power. Zelensky, former comedian and actor, has played his hand, although again, another very difficult hand, beautifully to this point. Now, it is inspirational to see Ukraine handing out Kalashnikovs to anybody who can pull a trigger, until you think about the fact of what total war will bring. Because as we should know from the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, or the conflict in Vietnam, once any civilian might become a soldier by pulling out an assault rifle, means that all civilians are targets. And while it's to the credit of the United States that it sometimes has a degree of conscience about civilian targets, even though plenty of civilians have died in the wars that the United States has prosecuted since the end of the Cold War, I don't know that Russia will have such scruples. And what total war will mean is that, in many ways, and I was listening to one, I think it was Sky TV this morning, mentioning that Russia started the war with Plan B, which was to sort of fight the war the way the West fights, and lightning fast strike, encircle the cities, take down, basically win the war within 72 hours and done. Well, that failed. Now what? Now it's back to Plan A, the way Russia's used to fighting. Ring the artillery around the city and basically beat them into submission so they have no more will to fight. Now that's terribly dangerous in a place like Ukraine that has a history of surviving just soul-crushing brutality. Read Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands. This is the same area. These are the same people. Others have noted that Putin does not have enough troops for an occupation, especially if the Ukrainian people plan to submit today and stab a Russian, used to talking about the first century culture war, attack a Russian occupying force. So, no, there's a lot, and there always is this at the beginning of a war. I've seen it so many times. There's a lot of romanticism and inspiration at the beginning. But as the war drags on, it's blood and death and suffering. Now, again, an unnecessary war. I think most today who begin a war believe that the war is necessary. And of course, without a God to judge, it's within the court of public opinion. But we shouldn't be naive about what is happening now and what is to come, even though we don't really know how bad it will get. And it could get very bad indeed.
And I hope that's the case. One of the things that strikes me about this whole thing, when I kind of put my pastor hat on, is
Sky, you're mostly an author and a celebrity Christian pundit.
it's a reminder of how much of the world is affected by the deep, sometimes dark motivations of a single human soul.
Right.
Something deep in the soul of Vladimir Putin is broken and evil and pursued this completely unnecessary war. And look at what's unfolded because of one man's brokenness.
Yeah.
It is always a temptation to point to the individual and say, he's a monster. We do it to Hitler. You can do it to Mao, Stalin, Pol Pot, whatever American politician that's on the other side of the team you're really enthusiastic about. But it's seldom a good way to actually deal with the far broader, dare I say, spiritual realities, one level up, or even more, of what we're dealing with. You can't just say, Putin is evil and so this happened. That's lazy. And as a pastor, no. Jesus himself says, even those you who, and yeah, you know how to give good gifts to your children, even though you're evil. Solzhenitsyn, the line between good and evil runs through all our hearts, including Putin. And it might feel tremendously satisfying. Dare I pull a word from our much more recent political vocabulary? It might feel very much satisfyingly othering to sort of dismiss Putin as evil or a monster or crazy, etc., etc., etc. Those kinds of things, actually in the real world, tend to lead towards disaster because you underestimate your adversary, your opponent, or the person on the other side of whatever conflict you're trying to wage. Putin rolled the dice. It's not going well for him. There's lots of evil things we know about Putin. I'm sure there's some good things. One of the things that was brought up is how come every president that has had to deal with Putin one way or another basically thought, we can manage Putin. You know, George W. Bush saw his soul by looking into his eyes. Remember that? Biden, Hillary Clinton, they were going to reset. Barack Obama reset our relationship with Russia. Remember that? Putin isn't the victim of some sudden derangement or some religious apocalypticism. Perhaps. Who knows? But he's just evil, and that explains it. It's an unnecessary war. Come on. This is your level of analysis? Because putting your pastor hat on, you know people that well? Well, let me tell you, putting my pastor hat on, I see people all the time doing really evil things, and they're not wholly evil. I'm a Calvinist. And I think Jordan Peterson's observation that when you go to Auschwitz, your response shouldn't be, Hitler was a monster. We can't understand how a human being could be Hitler. No, you'd better go to Auschwitz and say, there but for the grace of God go I. Not in terms of only the victims, but also in terms of the guards. A good reading of A Hiding Place might be in order here. Because those of us sitting in North America in relative comfort, affluence, and security had better have a moment of quiet humility when facing someone like a family who courageously hid Jews, and someone like Corrie ten Boom, who had the courage to go and preach the gospel in Germany and met a former guard who humiliated and brought unbelievable suffering upon herself and her sister and was responsible for her beloved sister's death. And she understood the cost of forgiveness and what reconciliation means. So let's not go blathering about some individual evil that is in Putin's heart and everyone else is just following orders. Again, go back to Jordan Peterson on totalitarian systems. We tyrannize ourselves. No, this is far more complex than bad guys and good guys. I was sort of waiting to see what Rebel Wisdom was going to put out. And because I knew David was going to have to put out something on this, and somebody that he had spoken with before, going into a bit of Putin's religious mission. And there have been a lot of pieces out about Putin and his relationship with the Russian Orthodox Church. There's a channel that I've mentioned before. It's a very interesting channel, Ready to Harvest. And he also came out with a piece, Russia versus Ukraine, Orthodox Church fight. I know that there's a lot of people who have a lot of history of a lot of conflict between Protestant churches or Protestant Catholic fights that look at Orthodoxy. The Orthodox Church of America is just one group that's sort of above the fray. Well, that's only possible if you really don't try to read any history of how politics and religion has played with Orthodoxy. And so the whole video, his videos are interesting. Maybe I'll just play a little clip to give you a sense of it. If you're the kind of person that just sort of likes facts, and this guy his videos are for you, because he is so not me, rambly, taking your time to make your point, all of the things that some people love to criticize in the comment section. Not this guy. He gets right down to it, and it's all facts and data.
Over political control of Ukraine, there's also been a war going on for spiritual control in what some have considered the most major split in Orthodox Christianity since the East-West Schism. But to understand it, we must take a step back and examine how the Orthodox Church operates. Prior to the East-West Schism, which divided the Church into Catholic and Orthodox, or as they are sometimes referred to by the other side, the Roman Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox, they were just one church. Not to say that there weren't subdivisions in the Church. Even today, within the Catholic Church, you have the Latin Church and the Eastern Catholic Churches, all in communion and all under the authority of the Pope. And before the East-West Schism in 1054, there were separate administrations in the Church too. If we go back to the time of Emperor Justinian of the Roman Empire, we find that he had established laws regarding the Christian Church, stating that the government would be in a system called pentarchy, the rule of five. Those five were the heads or patriarchs of the major episcopal sees of the Roman Empire, which were Rome first, followed by Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem.
Now, the rest is history has been doing a lot of history around these things, so I'd recommend that podcast. If it's not particularly church history, although, of course, Tom Holland keeps an eye out for that, but a lot of the history of the kings and wars and such.
The pentarchy system was never fully accepted by the Church, but it showed that an order of prominence was something that these various episcopal sees were considering. The question of who has primacy and whether anyone should have supremacy within the Church was one of the major issues that caused the 1054 schism. The churches that would become the Eastern Orthodox recognized Rome and the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, as first among equals. But these so-called Roman Catholics...
And why that would be, again, the rest is history. Just had a really wonderful two-part series on the Roman Empire. When did the Roman Empire fall? What on earth is the Roman Empire? And, Russia will come into this as well.
Catholics viewed the Pope of Rome as supreme, not as an equal to the other patriarchs. So today, with the Catholics and Orthodox divided, for the Orthodox Church, Rome isn't currently in the picture. So the order of precedence begins with Constantinople and its patriarch as first among equals, followed by Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. And there's been more added. So if you continue, next is Russia, then Serbia, then Bulgaria, and so on.
And right away there, you say, oh my, what, Russia after Jerusalem? And again, watch the rest of this history to get some sense of that. But I'm not going to play the whole thing. It gets, the history of Ukraine, which again, the rest of this history has looked at. We can jump ahead a little bit to some of this. It's a good video. It's only 11 minutes. Again, he's the anti-me. He just gets right down to it and says all the facts.
But the Ecumenical Patriarchate says this was not the case, that Kyiv remained within the Ecumenical Patriarchate's jurisdiction. In practice, over time, the Metropolitanate of Kyiv became absorbed into the ROC and lost any significance. The Russian Orthodox Church held control over what became the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and for a while, this was not challenged.
It's a little funny that ROC can mean Russian Orthodox Church, or it can mean basically, wasn't that the Russian Olympic Committee?
Meanwhile, on the political side of things, in 1919, two countries, the Ukrainian People's Republic and the West Ukrainian People's Republic, signed the Unification Act, attempting to create an...
Now, anybody watching this should say, 1919? What could have been happening in the world in 1919? There's that First World War. Then there was the Russian Revolution. And, history matters.
Independent and unified Ukraine. Civil war ensued on top of war with neighboring countries, and in 1921, Western Ukraine was ceded to Poland. Later that year, on October 14 through 30 of 1921, Ukrainians held a synod in Kyiv and declared the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church. But just a year later, in December of 1922...
Now that autocephalous is a very important word if you keep watching the video, because cephalus, that word just rings a bell, like a medical word, has something to do with the head. Autocephalous means headship. It means it's ruling itself.
What remained of Ukraine became a founding member of the USSR. The USSR became atheistic, and the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church initially remained operational. The Soviets wanted control over the churches, and they wanted to pit the UAOC against the ROC to destabilize both. But ultimately, the UAOC came to be persecuted and disappeared from existence within Soviet Ukraine. In 1991, the church was resurrected and began to grow and came to have 3 million members, mostly in western Ukraine. Other Orthodox churches didn't recognize the church officially, but it still was invited to participate in some synods or conferences. That leaves us with 2 Orthodox churches in Ukraine, but that's not all. In 1990, the Russian Orthodox Church gave more freedom to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, allowing it self-government, but not autocephaly. In 1992, bishops of the Ukrainian
This is so church.
Orthodox Church declared that they would operate autocephalously and selected the longtime Metropolitan of Kyiv, Filaret Denisenko, as the church's primate. They then submitted the request of autocephaly to the Patriarch of the ROC. The ROC rejected the request, asked Filaret to resign, which he initially agreed to do, but then recanted, saying he had been pressured. Filaret decided to go forward with declaring an autocephalous church against the will of the ROC in June of the same year, but the bishops didn't go along with him, and when he moved to put his see...
We Protestants play these games, we just don't have the nice clothes. Let's jump ahead.
...jurisdiction over Ukraine. Then the Ecumenical Patriarchate lifted the excommunication of Filaret, which they had previously recognized, and also that of the UAOC's Metropolitan. They declared that although the UAOC and Kyiv Patriarchate were not officially recognized, that their sacraments were viewed as being valid. Now the goal was to unite the two churches to produce a new autocephalous Ukrainian church. On December 15, 2018, the Kyiv Patriarchate and the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church dissolved themselves, and the Orthodox Church of Ukraine was formed in a unification council at which at least 2 bishops from the Russian Orthodox-led Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate were also present. In January 2019, it was granted autocephaly by the Ecumenical Patriarchate, something that the Russian Orthodox Church vehemently opposed and refused to recognize. That leaves us today with 2 Orthodox churches in Ukraine. The Ukrainian Orthodox Church, sometimes still identified as the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate, which is under the Russian Orthodox Church, though it has a high level of independence, and the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, not recognized by the ROC, but viewed as autocephalous by the Ecumenical Patriarchate. As of 2018, the former had 12,092 congregations, and in the 7 months after forming, a reported 500 of those left for the new church, which in 2019 claimed over 7,000 congregations. The Moscow Patriarchate disputed many of the defections, claiming only 61 parishes transferred. As soon as the new Orthodox Church in Ukraine was declared, the Russian Orthodox Church broke off relations with the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople, leading to a still continuing schism in the Orthodox Church. On the question of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine's autocephalous status, the Patriarchate of Alexandria, Church of Greece, and Church of Cyprus have formally recognized the Orthodox Church of Ukraine as autocephalous, while others, such as the Greek Orthodox Church of Antioch and Romanian Orthodox Church, have not done so. Meanwhile, Russia and Ukraine are now in a full-scale war. Vladimir Putin has in the past heavily criticized what he claimed was political interference from the Ecumenical Patriarch, and he's no fan of the new Orthodox Church in Ukraine. It's absolutely certain that this strong tension will shape the two Ukrainian churches even further.
So I've played a few minutes of it. I like his channel. It's a cool channel. You can learn a ton of church history just because it's just like boom, 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 facts and data. Especially if that's your kind of thing. So yeah, history matters. Now, I'm not going to get it. Well, I am going to get into the question of the religion, and those of you who are looking at the slide can see that I nearly obscured the word religion, the religion of America. Because, surprise, surprise, dread Christian nationalism, the religion of America is Protestantism. But the religion of America, American Protestantism, has in fact been so successful, it doesn't even need to be seen as a religion anymore. It's right there below the surface. And we don't even need institutions anymore, at least not ecclesiastical institutions, because why do you need those dollar bills when you have all the pennies you could ever need? That's kind of the situation of religion and politics in America. We're going to have a lot to say about the conquest of the main line. That's not the main line being losing, but the main line in some sense winning to the degree that it's no longer necessary, sort of like the March of Dimes and polio. And the questions about Christianity as we get into what is really beyond modernity and liberalism. Now, this fella, J Mearsheimer, I first was drawn attention to him because, of course, I just did this conversation with Rod Dreher, and if you take a look at Rod Dreher's blog, some of you will enjoy Justin Trudeau and the Misuse of Words. Haven't read it yet. Let's see if I can scroll down. Dreher is gifted strange loves of the sofa. Yeah. This is the video that Dreher linked that caught my attention.
Talks about democracy promotion. That means toppling your regime. And you won't be surprised to hear this. They don't like that in Beijing, and they don't like that in Moscow. Right? They do not like that. Right? The Chinese believe that we're behind the protests in Hong Kong. You go to Beijing and you talk to Chinese elites, the idea that we're promoting democracy around the world, and especially in East Asia, just drives them crazy because they think they're in the crosshairs. And you know what? They are in the crosshairs. Because our basic strategy is to topple regimes all over the world, not simply because we like democracy, but because we believe that whoever gets elected will be pro-Western. So we're killing two birds with one stone. We're promoting democracy and getting leaders who are pro-American. But again, you can see the strategy here: NATO expansion, EU expansion, and promoting democracy. Say a bit more about NATO expansion because it's so important.
And he'll go into that in that video. And basically 2015, he said, well, you're kind of putting Ukraine in a bad position because, well, and now we sort of see it. And of course, other people say, well, yeah, the Russians are really promoting this video on social media. Yeah, I could understand why. So now PVK is a Russian dupe. I don't think so. But isn't that always the way it is with the Russian dupes? Oh, we have all of these catch-22 arguments, don't we? If you deny you're a Russian dupe, then you are a Russian dupe. Okay, all right. Well, because I'd watched that video, or at least a portion of that video, this video came up, which I found to be really helpful in terms of the religious question, the dollars behind the pennies. And it's actually a part of 3 different videos. I've watched 2 of them. I haven't watched the third one yet. The third one is much more political application. And I, again, I've said negative things about Skye Jitani and about Phil Vischer, and now I'm going to say positive things about J Mearsheimer, as if I'm not in some ways more aligned with Skye Jitani and Phil Vischer because we're all Christians, and I know almost nothing about J Mearsheimer, and I'm sure I'll learn a lot more when I read the comment section on this video, because a whole bunch of you know more than I do about a whole bunch of different things, and you'll give me some little tidbits in the video about it. But what am I pointing to? Am I turning my channel into a political channel now all of a sudden because there's a war on? No. It's because of the religion under us all, that the hardest religion to see, especially in a secular world, is the religion that we simply assume.
The outline for tonight is that I'd like to start by defining what I mean by liberal hegemony and explain to you why states pursue it. Then I'd like to explain when states pursue liberal hegemony. So the first part will deal with the why, the second part is when. And then in the third part, I want to talk about what it looks like in practice, and then finally explain to you why it is prone to fail disastrously. So the first part of the talk is on the subject of what is liberal hegemony. Just a few words about its policy relevance. Then what I really want to do is talk about its theoretical underpinnings. With regard to its policy relevance, I think almost everybody who studies IR in my world agrees that it has been the foreign policy of the United States since the Cold War ended, that the United States has pursued liberal hegemony. And for those who have any doubts, the argument usually goes that it wasn't really true up until 2001, but clearly it was true after 2001. But most people agree that during the entire Cold War period, it has been the foreign policy of choice. And moreover, it's a foreign policy that the American elite loves. As I said the other night, we sometimes refer to the American foreign policy establishment as the blob. This is Ben Rhodes' terminology, Ben Rhodes, who worked for Barack Obama. The blob is deeply wedded to liberal hegemony.
And blob and blue church are not that far away.
And it includes both Republicans and Democrats. There's this myth in the land, mainly purveyed by Republicans, that Republicans and Democrats have very different views on foreign policy. This is poppycock. It's Tweedledee and Tweedledum, right? And they love their liberal hegemony.
I really ticked off a lot of my, at least in the Christian Reformed Church, progressive friends when I noted that when it came to foreign policy, there's very little difference between Barack Obama and George W. Bush. Everybody just, was horribly offended at the second Iraq War. Okay, but Barack Obama didn't stop the drone strikes in Afghanistan. Barack Obama basically continued the George W. Bush foreign policy. He's right. This liberal hegemony as international relations has been, since the end of the Cold War, the way that American foreign policy has worked. And it has a religious underpinning. We'll get there.
Donald Trump is an exception. He ran against liberal hegemony. And where he ends up remains to be seen. But
now, yeah, well, he didn't do much. He sort of schmoozed North Korea into quietude. But my take on Trump, and I know some of you won't like it, because all of this is like Jordan Peterson's helicopter that I mentioned in the past video. You could say helicopter, and we all have ideas. Helicopter, good, bad. A helicopter is far more complex. Trump is far more complex. Biden is far more complex. Everything in the world is far more complex. This little this little idea that has underpinned Jordan Peterson, Jonathan Bateau, John Vervaeke's work, even though they all have different politics from each other to one degree or another, is combinatorial explosiveness. The world is way too massive, and so we reduce it into things like the word helicopter for a particular machine, and our view of it is very low resolution. But my low resolution take of Donald Trump was that he was, by and large, a blustering, lazy president. Didn't accomplish much. Hate me for it if you like, that's fine. But I've got thoughts about Biden that I'd rather not share. Presidents that are in office, I'll wait till they're after office or before they're in office. Trump was a staple in sermons of mine before he ever went to office because he was an example of so many things that one could preach a sermon about ever before he came to office. But again, back to the binary. If it's just all binary in your thinking, you have a very low resolution view of the world, and it needs to be higher.
He ran against it. Now, a little bit about the analytical foundation of liberal hegemony, and this grows out of my discussion from last time. As I said to you, liberalism is at its root a political philosophy that focuses on the individual and places enormous emphasis on inalienable rights. Inalienable meaning they apply to everybody and they cannot be taken away. And the point I made last time, and I'd like to emphasize again tonight, is when you marry that sense of individualism with inalienable rights, you get a universalist ideology. Right? And the point I made last time and make again here is that liberal hegemony, or even liberalism, when it applies to foreign policy, has this universalist dimension that is of great importance. And what it means in terms of a broad foreign policy goal is that you quickly become consumed with spreading liberal democracy across the globe. That emphasis on inalienable rights, which leads to universalism, produces a foreign policy that emphasizes the spreading of liberal democracy. And there are three reasons for that. This really gets to the heart and soul of the argument, and I'll unpack them all, but just put them up in laundry list fashion right now. You want to spread democracy for three reasons. One, to protect human rights across the world. Two, to cause international peace. And three, to protect liberalism at home. And again, all of this grows out of the emphasis on individualism and inalienable rights, as I'll make clear as we go along here. So let me start by talking about protecting human rights across the world. The basic argument is that people who live in a far-off country are no different than people who live in your country. Borders actually don't matter very much. Rights are of great importance, and everybody has rights. And when the rights of non-Americans are being threatened, Americans have a responsibility to do everything they can to protect those people whose rights are being violated.
Now, what he just said there, so many of you will listen to say, yeah, that's right. And in many respects, I say that too. And this idea, as I've made in previous videos, is deeply wedded to the history of Christianity and to Christianity. This idea of the universality of the image of God and all of these image bearers, and human rights are based on this idea of the image of God. All of this comes to us. And you can point to Tom Holland's Dominion. All of this comes to us through Christianity and has had supremacy in the world because of Christianity. But now there are implications for this with respect to a whole lot of other things that come along, nation states, individual rights, and tensions with other very powerful ideologies such as nationalism.
And of course, the most important right here is the right to life. If some foreign dictator is murdering large numbers of his or her people, the United States has a responsibility that grows out of this universalism to protect the rights of those individuals that are being violated.
There's a really good documentary that you can find on YouTube. It's from PBS. I think it's probably from the American Experience, on the Spanish-American War. That's a piece of The Rest is History video about American Crusades that I want to play at a future podcast. But we're all barking up the same tree. And we just saw this with Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan and the panic about what will happen to the young girls and women of Afghanistan. It's all part of the same picture.
Now, this goes so far in the liberal discourse that you end up getting the argument that non-liberal governments are in a state of aggression with their own people. Just think about that statement. This is Michael Doyle, mainstream, prominent, liberal international relations theorist at Columbia University. He's basically saying non-liberal governments, no matter what they do, non-liberal governments are in a state of aggression with their own people.
So I was thinking about this video this morning. I thought, well, I wonder if there's a map around that would basically show the world in terms of democratic and non-democratic countries. And of course, just plug that into the old search engine and boop, up it comes. Democracy countries in 2022. And of course, the more purple is the most totalitarian. So China has a score of 1, and Canada and the Scandinavian countries have a score of 10. Russia's not quite as undemocratic as China. But so I read through this. What is democracy? Blah, 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 blah. Not all democracies are created equal. And then it talks about its democracy credit score, its democracy index a bit. And this got a little interesting. Let's see if I can find the quote I'm looking for. Oh yeah, the 10 most democratic nations in the world. Norway, number 1. Iceland, number 2. Sweden, number 3. Boy, those Vikings were democratic. New Zealand, number 4. Finland, number 5. Ireland, number 6. Canada, number 7. Denmark, number 8. Australia, number 9. Switzerland, number 10. The United States, all of these have scores above 9. 10 is perfect, and 9 is, getting there. The United States only has a 7.9 in 2020. And again, landed the flawed democracy category where it resided since falling from full democracy in 2016. What happened in 2016? You notice that we're basically redefining democracy here according to what? Well, they're going to tell us because, again, listen to people. They'll usually tell you. Intolerance of COVID-19 restrictions. That's the first thing they mention. So democracy is all about tolerance of COVID-19 restrictions from your government. Even though, just looking at the list, Sweden had a very different COVID-19 posture than many of the other nations, and it was quite controversial because, you would have imagined that Sweden would have been masked and vaxxed and, locked down as much as anyone, but they weren't. And Canada, of course, we've just been through that, but there's a lot going on in these conversations that if you pay a little bit more attention, it gets quite interesting.
What happens here is that you go from a situation where you can use your military forces to intervene in different countries when there are gross violations of individual rights and fix the problem and then leave. You go from that more modest policy to one where you decide that the best way to protect rights is simply to turn another country into a liberal democracy. Because once it's a liberal democracy, the individual rights, which are privileged in liberalism, are protected by definition. So if you have a planet that is filled with nothing but liberal democracies, the problem of gross violations of human rights is simply taken off the table. If you merely just act like a fire department and you only intervene in those situations where you see rights being violated, you fix it, and then you get out, you don't ultimately solve the problem. So what this emphasis on protecting rights does, especially when it's taken in the form that Michael Doyle lays out, it leads to the belief that what you want to do is populate the planet with liberal democracies. Second reason to spread liberal democracy, it leads to international peace. Virtually everybody in this audience, I'm sure, knows all about democratic peace theory. Democratic peace theory is based on the basic liberal template involving rights and tolerance, right? It's the whole idea that people across the planet have a set of inalienable rights and that they tend to respect the rights of other individuals, right? And that leads to international peace, right? If you can spread democracy across the planet. In other words, if you create a world of all democracies, they're not going to fight against each other because people respect the rights of people in other countries and they're tolerant. The tolerance grows out of that emphasis on inalienable rights, as I talked about last time. This is basic democratic peace theory, and this is the basic liberal logic that underpins it. Right? Moreover, it solves the twin problems of nuclear proliferation and terrorism. Right? If you have peace, you don't need nuclear weapons. There's no need for nuclear weapons in a world where there's nothing but liberal democracies. And terrorism is certainly not going to be a problem because in the liberal story, liberal states never engage in terrorism. It's always non-liberal states. So the idea is to create a world where they're just liberal democracies. And this is the rationale for invading Iraq. Sometimes people will say to me, John, how can you say that invading Iraq was based on a liberal theory? Well, the invasion of Iraq and the Bush doctrine more generally, as I'll make clear as we go along here, was based on the assumption that if you could go into Iraq, go into Iran, go into Syria, you could turn the greater Middle East into a sea of democracies. You could turn them into a sea of democracies, cause peace, there would be no nuclear proliferation, and there would be no terrorism. That's what they thought would be the end result. This is why the Bush administration thought that Al-Qaeda itself was not the problem. Al-Qaeda was part of the problem, but rogue states in the Middle East, rogue states meaning non-democracies that don't dance to America's tune, have to be turned into liberal democracies. So once that happens, then you turn the Middle East into a zone of peace. And
now, in all fairness, rogue states were basically states that were non-functional, that you couldn't basically hold to account that if an attack came from there, then you are justified in bombing their cities back to the Stone Age. Now, even just that phrase, bombing cities back to the Stone Age, that was a popular one after 9/11, being that basically America is now justified in bombing cities of places like Afghanistan back to the Stone Age. Of course, we are bombing cities in Iraq back to the Stone Age. That sounds so self-righteous of us, but if Russia bombs the Ukraine back into the Stone Age, somehow it won't feel the same, will it? And this is where you get into these I think about these theories of justification, that we have all these stories of justification that justify some things and not the other, even though the outcomes look like piles of rubble. And, well,
by the way, this is exactly what happened in Europe, according to the liberal story. Why do we have peace in Europe? Because it's filled with liberal democracies. And I'll talk more about this in the context of Nato expansion. They don't fight each other. You don't get terrorism. You don't get nuclear proliferation. Third, just on the business of international peace. What you also see in the literature on liberal democracy is
I don't know why Yale University couldn't master OBS and not have the poor cameraman just pan up to the PowerPoint and then pan down to him.
Of peace is a tremendous emphasis on the word community, especially international community. You surely have all heard the word international community many times. International community is very much a liberal term. Think about the opposite of international. It's national. When the journal International Security was created, there was a huge debate about whether to call it national security or international security. And they called it international security, right? International, right? And it's the international community, giving you the sense that there are really no meaningful borders among the states that exist in that community. Those borders are very porous. We talk about the transatlantic community. We talk about the European community, the EC. We went from the European Steel and Coal community to the European community to the European Union, right? But the European community. We talk about security communities, Karl Deutsch's famous term. Woodrow Wilson used to talk about communities of power, right? And of course, in these communities, you're not going to have any war. That's the basic.
Wouldn't say communities of power today. Power is a bad word, unless, of course, we're talking about the power of the weapons that we're smuggling to Ukrainians to prosecute their total war against the invasion.
Argument. Third reason to spread liberal democracy is to protect liberalism at home. The fact is that virtually every liberal theorist understands that you're not going to convince every single person in a liberal society that liberalism is the ideal political system. And there's always a danger on the home front that there'll be a group that is powerful and will attempt to overthrow the liberal order. And what really scares liberals is the thought that that group on the home front will form an alliance with a foreign country. And that foreign country will help fuel revolution at home.
Isn't that precisely the fear of Democrats who now, sort of like Cold War Republicans, see Russians under every Facebook post?
Okay. So if you live in a world of all liberal democracies, that problem is taken off the table. That's reflected in Woodrow Wilson's famous words. He went before Congress on April 2nd, 1917, to ask for a declaration of war against Germany. And that's where he made his famous remarks that his aim was to help create a world that could be made safe for democracy.
Now, it's helpful, again, to remember the history of the first part of the 20th century, too, because after the First World War, during the 30s, there was a lot of fear that democracy itself was no longer tenable. And, of course, Woodrow Wilson had made safe for democracy. Roosevelt would have, for the Second World War, the arsenal of democracy. But part of the fascination in the Soviet project, of course, don't tell anybody about the starvation of the Ukraine, and the inspiration of the Germans. Wow, they seem to have pulled that country up fast under their very dramatic leader Adolf. Was that democracies can't stand up. Democracies are difficult. It's hard to mobilize them for war. When body bags start coming home, support starts to be undermined. And of course, look at Vietnam. I remember a staunch conservative friend of mine in college that basically continued to argue in the early 80s, that the only reason that we lost the Vietnam War was because of the press and the liberals back at home. Other than that, we could have won the war. But that then pushes the point of, what would it have meant to win the Vietnam War? Oh, liberal hegemony is under that side as well. As the point he made, both sides in the United States and broadly in the West, I would imagine, agree with this vision of liberal hegemony.
A world that could be made safe for democracy, because he understood that liberal democracy sometimes exists in a tenuous state. Just to give you two other examples of this. The United States and the Red Scares after both World War I and during the early Cold War was the basic fear here. The basic fear was that there were communists in the United States, and those communists would ally with a communist state like the Soviet Union, and the end result of that would be trouble, if not revolution, on the home front. So if you can create a situation where you turn the Soviet Union into a liberal democracy, you turn communist China into a liberal democracy, you just take that problem right off the table. And think about the problem today from China and Russia's point of view. What China and Russia today fear is that liberal groups and individuals inside those countries who are unhappy with the likes of Vladimir Putin will ally with the United States to undermine the regime. You go to Moscow today, you go to Beijing today, they are really worried about regime change. As hard as that may be to believe, regime change instigated by the United States in an alliance with liberal forces inside their own countries.
And now, don't get me wrong. I love democracy. I love the fact that we have the vote. I think democracies are, they're in some ways a great way to run a society, because what they allow for are peaceful transitions of power along the way instead of pent-up violent revolutions. And when you get to something, let's say, like the French Revolution, in some ways, the French Revolution was a lot of pressures bottled up that erupted in a great overreach. Whereas in other countries in Europe, they had constitutional monarchies back and forth. There's a long history of trying to figure these things out. And I think again, generally speaking, democracy is sort of the best way to go. But democracy isn't just simply had with an election. Strawn then today sent me an old Reddit post about many of the communist bloc nations, including the Soviet Union, that, of course, with the fall of the communist system, had to try to get to another system. And it's rocky because basically in a totalitarian system, you haven't sort of allowed sort of this measured garden of markets and democracy to grow that have been cultivated one way or another in the West, plus the cultures, plus all of this stuff. Again, one of the things that you should compare is the history of, let's say, English-speaking democracies versus, let's say, Latin America and the Catholic system. And so part of what you're going to get in this is the recognition of the deep ties between democracy and Protestantism. And previous generations were aware of these ties. Today, Protestantism has disappeared and simply become, in many respects, the water we swim in. And I'm a Protestant, so I'm not complaining necessarily, but maybe we should see the water, because there are downsides to this. And as we continue to move beyond modernity, and as modernity continues to recede, for all the reasons I talk about in my previous videos, these questions about the now, politics, religion is always, politics is now, religion is dollars, politics is cents, those questions are going to have to come due. And, again, in one of my conversations with Jonathan Peugeot, he sort of quipped that he was deep down a monarchist. Well, that makes perfect sense, given his orthodox commitments. There's a deep monarchical essence to Catholicism that in the 19th century and even in the 20th century led many in America to view Roman Catholicism with suspicion. Yesterday, we had our classist meeting in Central California, and we had to vote on an overture with respect to the Human Sexuality Committee, and we voted. Now, you'd say, well, what about the conciliar movement and the councils, church councils and church synods and Roman Catholicism, where bishops or cardinals vote? Yeah. Both sides are deep within Christianity. Christ inhabits the body of Christ, and also ordination, where an individual represents Christ. So you have in Catholicism synods versus ultramontanism, papacy. You see those tensions in orthodoxy. These are all below the surface, and so this is all tremendously religious at a very deep level. But so much of what is deep we don't know.
And again, if the United States was not a liberal country, this problem would be taken off the table. So, the underpinnings of liberal hegemony: emphasis on individualism plus inalienable rights gives it a powerful universalist impulse. And that impulse leads to a foreign policy committed to spreading liberal democracy around the world for those three reasons. When do states pursue liberal hegemony? This is the second big question. My argument is it depends largely on the structure of the system. It depends largely on whether or not the system is bipolar, multipolar, or unipolar. If it's bipolar or multipolar, in other words, if there are two or more great powers in the system, states cannot pursue liberal hegemony. They have to act according to balance of power logic. And in a minute, I'm going to explain to you why that is completely consistent with liberal theory. But just for now, understand that my argument is when there are two or more great powers, each of those great powers has to worry about the other great power, and therefore has to worry about the balance of power, and has to act according to balance of power logic. In a unipolar system, where there is a single great power, this is the United States, of course, when the Cold War ends, you can pursue liberal hegemony because you don't have to worry about the balance of power, because there is effectively no balance of power. You are Godzilla. And you are free to do pretty much what you want. And you understand what's happening here. If you're Godzilla and you have this liberal impulse hardwired into you, you know what you're going to do. You're going to try and create democracy all over the world. I'll say more about that in a second. But unipolarity is where you get liberal hegemony. And as I said, this is consistent with the liberal formula for dealing with conflict. Remember what I said last time. Liberalism at its root is a theory of conflict. Liberals assume that you have individuals, and those individuals cannot agree on first principles in all cases. And sometimes the disagreement over first principles is so powerful that people want to kill each other.
Protestantism. This comes out, of course, of the Protestant Reformation, where, gosh, we're going to kill each other over the Eucharist, over the papacy. In fact, we are killing each other over these things. Why don't we stop? So let's assume, Calvinism, that we're going to have differences of opinion.
And that is why you need the night watchman state. There's no liberal theorist who says...
Now, he walked through a bunch of these terms in the first video.
You don't need a state. The three-part solution or formula for preventing conflict is, number one, inalienable rights. If everybody has rights and everybody has the right to life, not going to be a lot of killing if you can convince people of that. Further,
now that's, again, a wonderful thing to say as such, but when you get down into the details, well, how far do these rights go? Right to life. Well, I say that, and of course it triggers the abortion debate in America. There's a thorny little detail. Is life as I imagine it basically my freedom, sort of negative freedom to pursue sexual satisfaction, economic satisfaction, emotional satisfaction? To what degree are these things rights? Are there microaggressions that are alive in the system?
Furthermore, there's going to be a lot of tolerance. So purveying the norm of tolerance is very important in the liberal story. But all liberals understand that emphasizing rights and emphasizing tolerance, those two things together, is not enough. You need a night watchman state. Think about the state of nature. Liberals start in the state of nature where individuals are constantly in a situation where there's potential for conflict and death. And what they do is they form a social contract. And the social contract involves a higher authority.
Now, any of you who ever studied Western Civ, all of this stuff is familiar. Enlightenment, rights of man, the Declaration of Independence, all of this stuff. It's all Western Civ. Now, if you don't study it, you just don't even know your own religion.
So you need that higher authority. There's no higher authority in international politics. There is no world state. There's no social contract, despite all this talk about community. Therefore, if you're surrounded by other great powers, you have no choice but to compete with them, according to liberal logic. Because according to liberal logic, without the night watchman state, you are back in the state of nature. The state of nature is anarchic. It's not hierarchic. The reason you form a state, a social contract, is to get out of anarchy. But you don't have that in international politics. And for that reason, when there are other great powers in the system, you have to compete with them, and you can't pursue liberal hegemony. But if you're in unipolarity, the imbalance is so great between Godzilla and all of the minions that Godzilla is free to pursue liberal hegemony. Right, that's the basic argument. Take this one step further. Bruno Montero, as you know, has written the seminal book on unipolarity, and he says in that book that the unipole has three options. If you think about it, these make perfect sense. First of all, the unipole can go home because it's so powerful and secure that it doesn't have to sweat what's going on in the rest of the world. You just go home. You won. We won the Cold War. We're Godzilla. Let's go home. Who's going to threaten us? And if the minions want to fight among themselves, who cares? That's one possibility. Second is you can stay involved abroad and use the power you have to maintain the status quo. Or number three, you can stay involved abroad and use that power to do social engineering on a grand scale. That, number three, is what Uncle Sam did, because Uncle Sam has this liberal impulse hardwired into it. And it, of course, has the capability in terms of raw power. And as I pointed out to you last time, social engineering is at the heart of modern liberalism. Modern liberalism is all about social engineering. And modern liberals have great confidence in social engineering. So when you put the distribution of power, this liberal DNA, which involves this universalist impulse and your belief in social engineering, you're off to the races. And that's exactly what happened after 1989. Talk a little bit about liberal hegemony in action. You get, as I just said, you get a super ambitious foreign policy. You also get a heavily militarized foreign policy. The United States is a militaristic state. Right? It's really quite remarkable. I'll talk more about this as we go along.
Let's talk about Jesus and John Wayne. Because now I'm going to use the language I just qualified earlier, the left and the right. The left loves to complain about militarism and the church. But I'll tell you, when the left wants to use it, they're awfully happy the military is there, even if they don't tend to be very good caretakers of the military often, because the military is deeply involved not in the nationalism, because we don't use troops locally. We have police for that. But the military is used internationally to pursue internationalism. And it's been very interesting that a lot of the people who were really upset at the Second Iraq War and at George W. Bush and the neocons because they had started a war are sort of keeping mum right now. They don't say a lot. I think inside they really didn't like what Biden did in terms of how he left Afghanistan, left those girls vulnerable. I mean, what makes sense of that? Liberal hegemony. Now in Ukraine, I'm against war, and I certainly am against Putin for starting this war, but should America get involved? And again, it's some Democrats that talk about no-fly zones, and it's like, are you serious? Are you serious? That's liberal hegemony. One thing is it's just glandular, but now suddenly Ukraine, which was too corrupt to be allowed into the European Union, had a whole bunch of issues. Well, now suddenly, we'll see what comes. Who knows? But what's to make sense of this underneath? It's the Protestant religion of America and our vision of the world and how we put it together. And again, I'm a Protestant. I love democracy. And I've lived in Latin America where democracy is a little tenuous often. We've got to wrestle with these issues.
Addicted to war. And these are low policy. The United States is a militaristic state. Right? It's really quite remarkable. I'll talk more about this as we go along. We're addicted to war. And these are liberal-driven wars. I'll talk a little bit about this tomorrow. Me and my realist friends have been against almost every one of these wars. And it's my liberal friends who are pushing these wars. I have some liberal friends who have never seen a war they didn't want to fight.
And what's so interesting is when you pour in, let's say, the counterculture, because many of the most progressives I know, the moment of greatest religious zeal comes in the 1960s with the opposition to the Vietnam War.
We have a highly militarized foreign policy. The United States has fought 7 separate wars since the Cold War ended, and it's been at war for 2 out of every 3 years since 1989. This is remarkable. Going back to Nuno's template, I thought we won the Cold War. We could go home and relax. We're so powerful. But no, 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 that's not what we did. And we did it for liberal reasons. Liberal hegemony action. 2 cases. Let's talk a little bit about NATO expansion. As you know, when the Cold War ended, shortly thereafter, in the Clinton administration, they began to talk about expanding NATO. And as I'll make clear as we go along here, this is one of the principal causes of the conflict with Russia over Ukraine. The first expansion.
Remember, this is 2015. Actually, this I think is 2017. The first video I played was 2015.
Expansion was in 1999. We brought in Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. The second expansion was in 2004. We brought in the Baltic states, Romania, Slovenia, Slovakia.
Now, most Americans pay zero attention to things like this. How will they affect my life?
So forth and so on. And then after 2008, we were talking about bringing in Ukraine and Georgia. Now, when things blew up after the February 22nd, 2014 coup in Ukraine, when things blew up between us and the Russians, they took Crimea, so forth and so on, everybody said the Russians are a threat to overrun Eastern Europe. The whole purpose of NATO expansion was to contain Russia, and thank goodness we were actually moving further and further into Eastern Europe. That's simply not true. That's simply not true. There's no evidence to support that argument. We were moving NATO eastward in large part as an element in a liberal strategy that was designed to take this security community, in the Deutschian sense of the term, that we had created in Western Europe during the Cold War and move it eastward. It included not only spreading NATO, it included spreading the European Union and promoting democracy. You all remember the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, and you remember the Rose Revolution in Georgia? This was all designed to take this security community and move it eastward. Michael McFaul, who I've debated on this issue of the Ukraine crisis, who was the U.S. ambassador to Russia from 2012 to right before the 2014 coup, says that I told Putin on numerous occasions, and I told his lieutenants on numerous occasions, that NATO expansion was not a threat to Russia. And he genuinely believed that. Barack Obama has said the same thing. He genuinely believed it. These people who were pushing NATO expansion did not believe in realpolitik and containment. In fact, they said that anyone who believes in realpolitik and containment, and that includes yours truly, is a 17th century person. That's right. We're dinosaurs. That world has gone away with the end of the Cold War. So NATO expansion was not motivated by realist logic. And by the way, virtually all the realists were opposed to NATO expansion and said, this is not going to have a happy ending. And George Kennan gave a famous interview to Thomas Friedman of the New York Times, who wrote it up. And Kennan said exactly that. This is unnecessary and it's going to lead to big trouble. And surprise of surprises, it led to a war in August 2008 between Russia and Georgia. And in
Anybody remember that? Except Bern Powers. He'd know about that. 2008, war between Russia and Georgia. You mean Atlanta, Georgia? No, not Atlanta, Georgia. Bern always says Tbilisi, or he's got an extra little vowel in there, Tbilisi, Georgia. That Georgia on the other side of the world.
2014, you ended up with a war between Russia and Ukraine over Ukraine. Right? But it was not driven by realist logic. Bush doctrine, a lot of people will say what's going on in the Middle East, or the greater Middle East, is that we are pursuing the American national interest in a realpolitik kind of way, and just disguising our behavior with liberal rhetoric. In fact, if you look at what the Bush administration said, that's not true. And as I explained to you about the Iraq case, we went into Iraq for the purpose of turning it into a liberal democracy, because we saw that as part of a story where there would be no more war in the Middle East. Once we got beyond Iraq and we got Syria involved and Iran involved and we democratized the entire place, it would all lead to peace, love, and dope, and it would take terrorism and nuclear proliferation off the table. That was the basic view here of what we were up to. Of course, it all crashed and burned, but that was the initial intention. And by the way, it was a remarkably ambitious foreign policy. I can think of no case in American history where we pursued a foreign policy that was as ambitious and foolish as this. The idea that we were going to democratize the Middle East, a region of the world that had hardly any history of democracy, at the end of a rifle barrel, is really remarkable. And of course, who opposed that war? Mainly realists. Some liberals did, much to their credit, but mainly realists. Why is liberal hegemony doomed? Reason number one. Social engineering in foreign countries is an extremely difficult enterprise under the best of circumstances. Indeed, social engineering in one's own country is especially difficult. But the idea that we can go into a foreign country, where most of the people don't speak the language, don't understand the culture, knock off the regime, right, and therefore create a lot of chaos, and then create order out of that chaos, and not just order out of that chaos, but create liberal democracy or even just democracy. This is a pipe dream. And using the US military for that? I spent 10 years of my life in the US military. I went to West Point. The US military, the US Army, these ground forces that we have, they're good at breaking things, they're good at killing people, they're giant killing machines. The idea that you could take the US Army and send it into Iraq and that it is going to be able to do nation building or state building in a sophisticated way, it's not going to happen, I can guarantee you. You want to send him up against Saddam's army in the middle of the desert in 1991, right? You want to do that? That's Bambi versus Godzilla, right? That's what the US Army or the US Marines are good at doing, right? But you start talking about taking the American military, putting it in a place like Vietnam, putting it in a place like Afghanistan, and letting it do social engineering, not going to work, right? But I don't even care if you bring in experts, it's not going to work anyway. And if it does work, it's going to take you a heck of a long time. But there are three other reasons it's not going to work. Second is, nationalism is a remarkably powerful force. You've heard me say that on more than one occasion between the last lecture and this one. And it causes the target state to resist foreign intervention. I won't go into a long song and dance about what nationalism is all about. I'd love to do that. But let me just say, self-determination and sovereignty are at the heart of nationalism. Right? The people in a nation state.
Now, it's funny when we say self-determination because all those selves are principalities. There are collective selves. America, Uncle Sam, John Bull, whatever instantiation or principality. Self-determination, it's really principality determination. So say we all. It's not me. It's not myself. You know, what self are we talking about?
Nation itself and the leaders who run a state, they want to determine for themselves what their domestic politics look like, and they want to determine for themselves what their foreign policy looks like.
Now, you've got also elements of the meaning crisis in here because, of course, self-determination. I'm, you know, we've got Sam Harris's meditation app. I'm trying to abolish the idea of myself because myself suffers. This is what happens when your religions just don't go in the same direction.
This is what sovereignty is all about. And they don't want a foreign country, whether it's the United States or the Soviet Union going into Afghanistan, or Britain going into Afghanistan, or France going into Vietnam. These people don't want foreigners
That's so racist. Not wanting foreigners to run in our politics. Well, that's xenophobia. Not wanting foreigners to run our politics.
Foreigners occupying their country. And who can blame them? As I point out here, think about the U.S. outrage over claims that the Russians interfered in the 2016 election. Apparently, from reading the newspapers, this drives Americans crazy. The idea that the Russians interfered in our elections. Well, we interfere in elections all over the planet. We interfere in the politics of states all over the planet. We think we have a God-given right to go into any country, violate sovereignty, if it's done for just purposes, which means promoting liberal democracy. We have a rich history of it, as you know. But as my mother taught me when I was a little boy, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If we're jealous gods when it comes to our sovereignty, don't you think that people in other countries are going to feel the same way? Don't you think the Vietnamese, after World War II, are going to want the French out? And then when the Americans replace the French, don't you think they're going to want us out? They are. You think the Afghanis are happy about us being there? You think that this is a long-term solution? Of course, you may believe we can do the necessary social engineering to fix the problem. Getting back to my first point, don't bet on it. You understand that Afghanistan is the longest war in American history, and we have now spent quite a bit more money on fixing Afghanistan than we spent with the Marshall Plan. And look at the results. Not pretty.
So, well, there we are. I mean,
reason number 3, individual rights. This whole concept of inalienable rights are oversold. If you sort of look around the world at surveys and you look at a number of historical cases, what you see is that people generally think rights are important, but they don't privilege them to the extent that the theory says they should. And people will often sacrifice rights for stability. There's a lot of survey data that shows that this is true today in the Middle East. Hardly surprising. If you lived in one of those countries that the United States has helped wreck, would you be interested first and foremost in creating liberal democracy, or would you be interested first and foremost in creating some stability? I think the answer is quite clear. Go to Russia today. Right? First time I ever went to Russia, I talked to all sorts of people about this issue. How do you think about liberal democracy? Liberal democracy means one thing to them, the 1990s. Tried that, been there, and it was a total disaster. Thank God we have Putin. If he's not a liberal Democrat, and he is a semi-authoritarian leader, more power to him. That's the answer you hear most of the time. Can you blame them? But what this means is that liberal democracy is not always an easy sell. It's not like you're going abroad and everybody's out there just demanding liberal democracy. Oh my God, this is the most important political system in the world, and if we can just get it, we'll live happily ever after.
Now, he's making his point strongly, and just recently on Joe Rogan, and I played some of that video where you had Najee Nawaz, wasn't that it? He was just on Joe Rogan. He talked about the fact that here he is, an Islamist in an Egyptian prison, was being tortured by the Egyptians, and he goes into great detail about his torture. And then Amnesty International comes around and basically helps put him on a path by which he would get out of there with his life. He would serve the rest of his sentence in a better way, and then he could go to Britain and travel the world and become a person of access to great power, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he makes the point again and again. If you invade a country and torture its people, they're not going to like you for it. It's not a hard thing for us to imagine. And there are many wonderful things about our system. Absolutely. Yet, again, Strawn sent me a link to a piece on Reddit where someone was actually writing out of Sweden, basically making the point that the transition from communism into an attempt at liberal democracy was, very, very difficult and a failure in some places. And it just goes on to prove that social engineering is not easy. And in fact, most often we fail at it. But what's beneath all of this? Well, it's our religion. It is our religion.
Not to say that there aren't many places where they would prefer liberal democracy over some semi-authoritarian system. There are cases like that. But the point is, it's not an easy sell. And then finally, some states actually act to balance against the Unipole. They act according to realist logic. This certainly has been true with China and Russia, and also with Iran and North Korea. I'm going to talk a little bit more about NATO expansion in a second. The Russians view NATO expansion from a purely realpolitik point of view. Right? This is balanced power politics. The idea that the United States can take a military alliance that was a mortal enemy of the Soviet Union and march it up to Russia's doorstep and make Ukraine and Georgia part of the West, it's not going to happen. They'll tell you that. It is not going to happen for balanced power reasons. And all you have to do is talk about the Chinese, about the presence of the American military in East Asia. It bothers them greatly. They do not like the idea of us being on their doorstep. And they'll tell you behind closed doors they intend to push us eventually out beyond the first island chain and then out beyond the second island chain. And I don't blame them one bit. But I'm just telling you, if you're interested in selling liberal hegemony to major powers in the system like Russia and China, you ought to understand that there are real limits to what you can do. And then, of course, you have minor powers like Iran and North Korea. Look at what North Korea is doing today. People say, oh, what North Korea is doing today is crazy. They're irrational. Kim Jong-un, we've never seen anybody this crazy. The thought of him having nuclear weapons is horrifying. I'd make a case that what Kim Jong-un is doing is very reasonable. If I were Kim Jong-un, I'd have nuclear weapons and I'd never, ever get rid of them. Never. Why? Because the United States is running around the world knocking off regimes. That's what liberal hegemony is all about. That means if you're not a liberal hegemonic state, think about what Michael Doyle said, you could be in the crosshairs. And how do you prevent regime change? The best way to do it is have nuclear weapons. We don't like that for understandable reasons, but from their point of view, it makes eminently good sense. Iran, I've said in public on a number of occasions, if I was the Iranian National Security Advisor, they'd already have nuclear weapons. And I can guarantee you that if they had nuclear weapons, the Americans and the Israelis would not be threatening them. Very simple. But the point that I'm trying to make to you here is that some states resist. Not all of them, but some. Some are foolish, like Colonel Gaddafi. We promised Colonel Gaddafi that if he gave up his WMD programs, we'd leave him alone. You know where he is now. He's 6 feet under.
And Ukraine, of course, gave up their nukes. And if Ukraine had nukes, would they be in this mess right now with Russia?
6 feet under, very foolish. Bottom line here is, if you can balance, balance. And some figure that out. So anyway, my basic argument is that liberal hegemony is doomed because social engineering is wickedly difficult, nationalism causes significant resistance, individual rights matter, but not that much. And it should be number 4, realism remains a key factor for some states. Talk a little bit about the Ukraine crisis. As I said to you before.
And, well, that's a few years ago. We know more about that now. Now, where does this leave us? I'd love to be able to give you some sweet, quick, perfect answer. But like many of my videos about the recession of modernity, I don't have one. As a Protestant in many respects, I've won. But the answer that we have of liberal hegemony can't win. There's deep, deep issues beneath. And the reason we're seeing, let's say, the resurgence of more monarchical political imaginations along with more hierarchical epistemic imaginations is because of the failures. I mean, you don't really fail until you've actually won in many respects. And this is communism hasn't been tried. Christianity hasn't been tried. Liberal hegemony hasn't been tried. And, I'm not saying Christianity isn't true. I believe it is. And I've got way more sympathy for Christianity hasn't been tried, except for the fact that this is where we get into Christian eschatology. I'm not a holiness perfectionist. I am a Calvinist, which believes that the only final resolution for this world's problems come from God. And that doesn't mean that there is never progress, and it doesn't mean that there isn't better or worse, and it doesn't mean that we ought not to do our best to strive for the best. Calvinism has been doing that all along in many respects, as have the other major branches of Christianity. And the whole question of eschatological realization, boy, that's a long word. Pastors shouldn't use that word. Basically, the hope of the age to come. And part of the reason, again, why I read True Believers in that last video was this is the impulse within us to somehow find our utopia. And even if we have a religious system that says God's kingdom on earth is not something that's made by human hands, still yet we are to try for proximal betterment. And all within the confines of, if in his first video he talks about, he's sort of a localist in inalienable rights, but foreign policy a little bit more pessimistic. Well, rightly so, as I think many of us are. We can't just unthink ourselves out of these systems. And this is part of the reason why I say Protestantism is deep within even the attempts at instantiating distributist Catholicism or a new monarchy based on orthodoxy, something like that. We just don't unthink these things that we've realized. And so in many ways, we have to move forward. And then we sort of move forward by feel. And we learn as we go. And in many ways, the stance of honesty and, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, even within a secular frame that sort of limits and undercuts it, seems necessary. So, while I'm at many points in this video expressing the challenges of Protestantism, I've still not given up on the project, because I will keep with the project until I see another project that I think shows more promise. But we have to be clearly aware of the kinds of successful narratives deep within the system that have gotten, in fact, that have been so successful that they're no longer even seen as religious. And I thought his video on liberal hegemony nicely played that out. So as with many things in the Christian life, a lot of the language I heard yesterday at my classis meeting, we move forward in prayer, and we move forward talking with one another, and we move forward with the law of love. And perhaps first we do no harm. And yeah, I understand why illiberal societies are in terror over the United States. I mean, again, one of the big lessons of all of this is going to be the tremendous power of soft power. And it certainly looks like Putin is going to lose this war, even if he might conquer and occupy Ukraine for a time. Because in a sense, well, maybe his standard isn't anywhere near as high as that of liberalism. Maybe all he needs to do is keep Ukraine dysfunctional, maybe a failed state on his border as a buffer between himself and NATO is sufficient. maybe Ukraine will be a garment of skin for Russia. But we have to recognize the religion beneath the garment of skin of secularism. Well, that could be a good title. And figure out how Christians ought to live. So, let me know what you think. I'm sure you've had thoughts. Put them in the comment section. I by no means respond to every comment, but I try to read as many as I can, and I probably are able to read 70% of them. So even if I don't give it the little heart, I've probably read it, and it's some member of my Consciousness Congress has listened and filed it away. And the same for many of the emails, and especially Facebook messages. I stay off Facebook, and so there's lots of messages in Facebook Messenger of people trying to get in touch with me. And so forgive me for my inability to necessarily respond to all of you individually. As I mentioned this week, I've got another day in my office tomorrow, and then I'm on an airplane, and I'm not going to have time in Salt Lake to do anything but the church business that I have to do. I am going to Grand Rapids for Synod, and so I'm planning on staying in Grand Rapids extra time afterwards. My wife and I will probably have some vacation, and I should be able to meet with the meetup. I don't know if I'll do Chicago in this trip or not, but we'll see. So that's coming down the pike. So again, leave a comment. Let me know what you think.